This is the Bob Davis Podcast YouTube channel. This is the channel where I talk about my podcasts, that I put up audio podcasts at thebobdavispodcasts.com. Usually what I do is I create content for the podcast, then I come back and create additional content or additional ideas and thoughts that I have from the audio podcast here on the YouTube channel. And I put links in the description box for people who want to check out the audio podcast. And I always appreciate people who are taking the time to, check out the audio podcast as well. So this podcast is kind of a celebration of 4 years on the road. Every Halloween, I do a podcast. This podcast I'm talking about, Bob Davis Podcast 1148, 4 years on the road, is a commemorative podcast. Originally, when I first left home to be a full-time nomad, I went out on the road, and that first night, I ended up in Iowa somewhere, and I did a podcast because I was so excited, and then that kind of became the tradition. So every year on Halloween, I've done a podcast celebrating whatever number of years I've been on the road, looking forward to the next year, whatever the number that is. This is 4 years total, looking forward to 5 years. The fifth year starts now. So that's what we're going to talk about in this video. And I want to start by talking about timelines a little bit. Yes, I know that I am saying two firm dates and firm number of years. Most of the time, I don't think about the number of years that I've been out doing my thing in this vehicle. I think about experiences, and I think about time in a different way. We nomads, full-time nomads, do not have a sense of linear time. If you've ever gone on a long vacation or a road trip, you'll find out that you'll be a little bit surprised and a little quizzical about suddenly it's Friday and tomorrow we have to leave. So if you do 10 days in Aruba, let's say, suddenly you've had such a great time and you're having a great time and you're seeing people, and maybe you've gone with somebody that you care about or with your family or whatever, as though you don't care about your family. You know what I mean. And after 6-7 days, suddenly you realize you only have 3 days left, and it's a big surprise. Well, being a full-time nomad is kind of like that. We look at time differently. We collect experiences and places, and sometimes I describe them as being poetic because there's no other real way to describe this feeling, and when you think about it in retrospect, it's almost like a dream. And I've mentioned that many times in podcasts and many times in videos, that it's not necessarily a dream life while it's happening, but it is like a dream later when you start recalling things about trips and people and places and things. It's almost like a dream. There are many things that I remember. I remember coming down out of a set of mountains in it's right on the Arizona border, Portal, Arizona, and there's a campground way up about 6,000 feet. And I remember coming down that mountain on Christmas Day, 2021. No, I think it was Christmas Day 2020. And the sky was incredible. It was dark on one side and sunny on the other, and there was a wheat field in front of me and this road, and it was just a moment that I remember, and I think about that often. Or coming down out of the mountains in Colorado and seeing these incredibly picturesque, perfect towns, and thinking, wow, you don't remember time. In fact, when I think about those experiences, whatever they are, driving down the PCH or driving through West Texas or driving through the Midwestern rural parts at the height of the growing season when there's just so much green everywhere, you don't remember the day. You don't remember the hour. You don't even often remember the month. You just remember that experience. The Adirondacks, the beaches of New Hampshire and Maine and Massachusetts, West Texas with all its oil fields, Pecos, Texas, all these places you remember. And I've crisscrossed across this country many, many, many times. I should say I crisscrossed across, I should say I've crisscrossed the United States at different points many, many times. And I find myself often crossing my trail from a previous trip because I travel a lot, and as I said in a previous video that I put up about podcast 1147, which has to do with Las Vegas and Joshua Tree, where I am right now, it is dreamlike so much in the respect that you forget that, for example, when I pulled in here, I'm in Joshua Tree at the BLM, which is the 14-day dispersed camping area, and it's a flat lake bed. You can sort of see, if you look around, you'll see what I'm talking about. And I pulled in and I found this campsite, and I was like, this is the campsite I camped at 3 years ago with a bunch of people. Very different then. There are a lot more people out here on the dry lake bed than there are now. But again, I can't emphasize the timeline issue more in terms of being able to tell you where I've been and the travel logs I've done. When I did the podcast, I had to go back and do research on my own website of places I'd been during 2024, let alone 23, 22, 21, and 20. And there's been many things. There's deaths in the family. There's people that we've camped with who've passed away. There are situations that weren't so great. And they all are part of this sort of maw of memories. And so when you get ready to do some kind of a retrospective video or podcast, it's almost impossible to remember where you were. In fact, there was a lot from 23-24 that I forgot, because these memories are not linear. And I just wanted to point that out before I sort of start talking about what I did in 2024. So one of the things about 23-24, so because the anniversary is in October, it's sort of a weird bifurcation of the year because it's October, particularly and specifically Halloween was my anniversary. And I will just say, I often say this, I've said it more than once, that I will never forget pulling away from my empty duplex. And I wrote my letters to the landlord. I personally, professionally cleaned the place. I had slowly but surely emptied out, given away, burned or thrown away literally everything that couldn't fit in this vehicle. And as the years have gone on, I've gotten a lot more organized, and a lot of stuff has come out of this vehicle that was never used, that I took with me on that fateful day in 2020. Now, I just want to rewind a little bit, because going back, I got this truck in 2015, right at the end of 2014, and I started traveling in this vehicle in 2014. It needed a new sway bar. I didn't even know that this body of the ambulance was sitting on the frame. I learned that 2 years later in Fullerton, believe it or not. And I would go out and I would go places. I remember I went in 2015 or 16, I went out to California, came out here, drove up the PCH, went all over the country at various times. And my idea was, I was in radio and I was out of the talk radio game, and I thought what I'll do is I'll go out and look for news stories, and I'll go to these news stories and report on what's going on. So there were things I went to and I talked about. I covered the election primaries down in Iowa a couple of times. So I traveled a lot before I decided to go full-time on that fateful day. And I mentioned in the podcast, I remembered just recently that I don't recall, well, I know I didn't, because I kept it very close to the vest. I didn't tell anybody. I didn't tell my business networking partners I was going to do this. I didn't tell too many people. There were a couple of key people that I told because I wanted to know what they thought I should do. I didn't tell anybody. So when I left, it was like a secret. And that made it even more like Christmas Day. It was so great. So I remember that my duplex was completely cleared out. I had placed the keys and the letters for the landlord and everything, because I didn't even tell him. But my lease was up, so I was out anyway. But I didn't even tell him that I was going to do this. After I had given away all my books, sold stuff, burned stuff, which really made me happy. And then I had to pay people to come and take the furniture away and all that stuff. And then I got in the vehicle, I started it up, I let it warm up for a while, and I drove away. And I realized when I drove away on that fateful day in Halloween of 2020 that I was looking at my duplex for the last time, and it was exhilarating. So that's where it started. This year is the first year that I would say that the pink cloud of that moment has kind of subsided. And now I have a little bit more clear-eyed view of what I am like, what I require, and what my idea of being a nomad is. I did not go on YouTube and watch a bunch of YouTube videos about how to be a nomad. I did not see the movie Nomadland before I left. I did not, again, tell anybody or seek any advice. The only thing I did do was I thought maybe I'd buy an RV, and I just didn't have enough money. I couldn't do it. So I remember saying to myself, I am not going out in this ambulance. Well, that's exactly what I did. And this thing has been an amazing, venerable vehicle, and it's 20 years old now. And it's, well, no, it's more than 20 years old. It's 24 years old now. It's a 2000. So it's 24 years old, and it's still, we've replaced so many things and fixed so many things, and I keep up on all the maintenance. So it runs, and it runs great. And it continues to do what I want it to do. As far as the 5th year, I don't know if I'm going to get another rig or stay with this or whatever I'm going to do. But again, this timeline issue, because there's so many travel experiences layered into that first 4 years, and there are things that happened which predicated certain things. And one of those I refer to as the quartzite diktat. Quartzite, Arizona, for a while, and I think probably still, is kind of a nomad mecca for a certain type of nomad. So if we go back to the 1980s, when those campgrounds in Quartzite first opened at the Bureau of Land Management, that was an RV mecca. So you had all these World War II veterans and Korean War veterans who decided to retire from Boeing or McDonnell Douglas or Chevy or wherever they worked, General Motors, or Ford. I got to get them all in, or Chrysler, if they were from Detroit, or 3M if they were from Minneapolis, St. Paul, and so on. And they and their wives bought an RV, and they decided they were going to travel. And what they would do is they would travel from Ypsilanti, as I like to say, or Detroit, Ann Arbor, Minneapolis, St. Paul, Fargo, or whatever, and they would come down to Arizona. And the weather was great, and it was cheap, and there were easily 300,000 or 400,000 RV people there in the early 80s, and that is not the case in Quartzite anymore. 4 years ago, it was busy, and I think it was busy with a new type of person, the van life person, the nomad life person, because of the movie. People came down, and they figured out that Quartzite was where the movie was set, and so everybody wanted to come to Quartzite, and everyone was cooped up. And so they got their PPP, and they got their unemployment, and they got their stimulus checks. They bought whatever they could afford, vans, used RVs, new RVs, and they came on down to Quartzite. That has changed. And the Quartzite diktat for me was, at a certain point during this period, in the last 4 years, inflation was so high that we had $130 a barrel oil at one point, I think in April of 2022. So travel became very expensive. And the idea was that you were going to basically sit someplace for a period of time until something changed. Now, I did podcasts and I did videos about the fact that inflation was eventually going to come down, and that we would go from inflation to disinflation to eventually deflation. Certainly there is powerful disinflation in oil prices. So now oil is cheaper, gas and diesel are cheaper, unless you're in California. We're back to 23 in California at $4.67 a gallon for diesel, but it's a lot cheaper than what it was over here. And the diktat for Quartzsite was, well, this is where I'm going to sit. And so I would camp there, and I camped there for 3 years. And the third year, last year, was not a good year. And I mentioned in the podcast, we camped in not a great place. We had to move at one point, and I think everybody was a little bit raw at the end of last year's camping. I had to go to a wedding in Florida, so I left in the last week of February and headed over to Florida, and I talk about the trip to Florida and some of the experiences I had going down to Florida and over to Florida in podcast 1148. I'll put the link in the description box. I always can't figure out where my hand is in this camera. A link in the description box. And, this year I was there. I had to leave because I had to go to Las Vegas to buy a new computer. And I just thought, I'm not going to go back because the situation there has deteriorated. Now, I'm not going to get too into that in this video because I think I've beaten that dead horse a little bit too much. I've flogged that horse a little too much. It is certainly discussed in detail in podcast 1148, which discusses the 4 years on the road and why I've decided that, given the fact that fuel is cheaper now, I can travel a little bit more now. And so that's the reason when I got to Las Vegas and I started coming back down and I got to this reference point for everything, which is the sort of cluster of truck stations at I-40 and US 95 right as you get into Arizona. I was there in 2020. That was where I recorded the last podcast of 2020, so the Halloween podcast of 2020. And I remember the trucks were lined up 20 deep, so 6 rows of refueling for the trucks, 20 trucks back at every one of those truck stops because it was so busy. And I remember people talking about how there's shortages and everything. And I remember doing a piece about how if you saw, I went and sat on a rock, which is near the end of the parking lot at the Love's truck stop, and you could see all the trucks going up and down I-40, and you could see in the distance a double-decker freight train, which was hauling stuff west, and there was another one hauling stuff east. So that was a very interesting experience. This year, I went there, and there was, a couple of trucks in the refueling bay, but basically, it's nothing like it was in that last part of 2020, or maybe 21, when I guess it was October of 21 when I had completed my first year on the road, and I was there, and it was great to be at that reference. And I thought, am I going to go back to Quartzsite and have the same experience that I have had every year for the last 3 years, and a deteriorated experience, or am I going to go somewhere else? And I thought, I'm going to Joshua Tree. So I came over here. Now, I don't know how long I'm going to be here. Last year, so the year of travel kicked off with me getting stuck in the Grand Canyon. I had to go out to New Hampshire for my nephew's wedding. Great trip. I went, the first time I went out east, I went along the Great Lakes. The second time I went out east, which was that year, I went along the lower part, and I went through the Adirondacks and the Catskills, and it was gorgeous. And the best part of that whole trip was I took it and I went out, this is in 23, went out so it was early. It was like August of 23, so it doesn't count as this year's travel. I went out, and I'll never forget seeing the abundance in this country from one end to the other of this just before harvest, all of this corn and soybeans and other things. People were growing wheat and whatnot as I headed out to New Hampshire. So that was a great trip. And then after the wedding, I beelined for the Southwest, and I decided I'm going to go to the Grand Canyon because I hadn't been to the Grand Canyon in a long time. And when I got there, I think I was there a week, and then I thought, well, I guess I'll go down to Quartzsite. And as I left, I blew a pressure hose and had to go back up there. And I ended up having a mechanical, which was a nightmare. You'd have to listen to those podcasts because they don't just they'll fix it, but you have to order the parts. So That was a whole thing. And I ended up being in Grand Canyon at the north end in the village for about a month. That's how long it took to get everything all fixed. And I had to get involved with UPS and it was crazy. But I had such a good time. That was just this incredibly euphoric experience being stuck in the Grand Canyon. I just loved it. And I didn't want to leave. I kept thinking, why is this happening? You know, maybe I'm supposed to get a job at the Grand Canyon. And I actually talked to one of the guys. They have these guys that float around who are sort of senior members of the Xanterra company, which is the old Fred Harvey company, which runs all of the vending and the restaurants and everything. It's now called Xanterra. It's part native owned. It's and I remember. I can't remember what I was talking about. I got off track. Sorry. I was in the canyon. Oh yeah, I remember talking to one of these guys that floats. They have these senior guys that just float around and make sure everything's working right. And I asked him, maybe I'm supposed to get a job here. He goes, maybe you are. That's what happened to me. I came here, my truck broke down, and now I've worked here for 18 years, and it's great. And I thought, well, maybe I'll just get a job at the Grand Canyon. And then we got it fixed, and off I went. And I came down to Quartzsite, and that sort of began the year 23-24, having this sort of less than optimal experience. And so when I was at that truck stop on I-40, I just thought, I'm going to have a different experience this year. I'm going to go to Joshua Tree. I might go over to Fullerton where I have family. I might go up the coast when it gets warm. I might go down to San Diego. There's a bunch of places over here, Death Valley and Tuttle Creek and Borrego Bay and all kinds of places, Borrego Springs, that there are to go in California and southern Arizona, Oregon Pipe, for example, that I've been to before and I really enjoyed. So I'm taking a more active role because, and this is the main point in this, I don't do well with content when I am just sitting. And I think, I had a friend who passed away, Tammy, and she used to say, it's not done till it's overdone. And we'd laugh because she was an extreme person. She was very extra. And she would do some crazy thing and there'd be consequences. And I'd say, what happened? And she'd go, well, it's not done till it's overdone. And I think about that a lot when I do things. And I enjoyed Quartzsite so much that I just kept going back. And I think for me, that's part of the deterioration. I don't know if it's considerably less than what it was 5 years ago, 2 years ago, 3 years ago. I think there's fewer people there. But it was time for me to get a new experience because I don't do well with content when I'm just sitting. So I have lots to talk about when it comes to Joshua Tree. And I'll have lots to talk about because I'm going to be able to travel because we don't have this incredibly ridiculous high fuel price that we had back in 22, 23. And I think we are going to see even lower prices for fuel, hopefully, in the near future. So for the time being, and I'm not making an economic prediction, I'm just saying for the time being, conditions are optimal for me to actually roll and to get out there in this thing and have some new experiences. So I'm very excited about that. And as far as the places that I went this year, I would just say that the best part, and I do want to dedicate this podcast to somebody that we lost this year, and I'll do that at the end, so stay tuned. The trips that I took last year, the best part of last year was going to the wedding, but it was after the wedding. The wedding was great, but then I went up the Outer Banks because I had been to the Outer Banks when it was winter and it was freezing. So I picked late summer because I wanted to be all along the outer islands, Georgia, South Carolina, and North Carolina, up to Kill Devil Hills to experience Ocracoke and all those places when it was warm. And I had some incredible ferry trips and seeing some sights along the National Seashore, and then up through Virginia, stopping at Bristol and redoing the History of Country Music podcast, which I loved, and then seeing my sister and being in Central Virginia at her farm on the Eclipse Day, and then heading all the way up back to Wisconsin and spending summer on the lakeshore. The best thing about summer was that solar storm when we had the aurora borealis. I was camped on the beach with this vehicle. I had a fire every night, and I would go out on the dock and watch these northern lights, and it was really, truly a sublime experience. Again, when I'm old and I can't do this anymore, I won't be able to tell you times, places, and things, but I will be able to tell you about some wonderful experiences and places and people. And speaking of people, I'm going to close with this. One of the things that kind of made me more standoffish this year, in the sense that I kind of don't want to get too close to people, was we had a person that camped with us, our friend Bonnie, who had a problem. I talk about it in the podcast at pretty detailed from our perspective, because we haven't talked to her family. And she was a wonderful lady. She was very sweet, very small and slight and pale. She was a vegan, and she had a physical problem, which is detailed in the podcast. And she wouldn't get it taken care of. She wouldn't go to the doctor, and we kept telling her, you've got to go to a doctor, go to the hospital at Parker, go somewhere where they can address this, because it wasn't that complex of a thing that any hospital could have addressed. But she didn't have health insurance, and she didn't have any money, and so she finally left courtside. I left in late February. I think she left in early April, maybe May. And she went back up to Idaho, where we didn't hear from her again. And we didn't know what happened to her. And I was camping with my friend Robert earlier this year, and he said, I don't understand why I haven't heard from Bonnie. I mean, we should have heard from her by now. So he ran it down, and she had passed away up there in Idaho. So one of the things about Quartzsite and one of the things about nomad life, and I talk about this pretty extensively in the podcast, so I don't need to belabor it here, is these are the kinds of things that happen, because it's real life. Whether you're a nomad or doing yoga or working someplace, it's just that back in the world we are separated from these experiences a little bit, and here it's right up in your face. So I'm a little more standoffish. I kind of want to be alone. I kind of want to camp alone, and I kind of want to travel alone. And part of it is because of that experience. So I'm dedicating this YouTube video to Bonnie. I know Robert dedicated one of his videos to Bonnie, and that's it, because that's Quartzsite. It's not all just people camping and having a great time and nomads. There's a lot of things going on there that make it potentially a different experience. Let's just put it that way. But the vibe out here is high. I'd like to continue with that vibe. I can't wait to go some other places. So stay tuned and keep listening to the podcast. Keep subscribed. Likes and shares are great. Subscribe to the Bob Davis Podcast on iTunes or whatever the music store is now. The podcast app. I don't know. I don't even know. But it's good to be out by myself traveling. And thanks for watching, and thanks for listening.